In the week between the French and British Grand Prix, the world was battered by a series of natural disasters. In South Asia, the monsoon rains had been much heavier than usual and caused severe flooding across the north of India and into areas of Pakistan and Bangladesh. In all, over 500 deaths were caused by the flooding and associated problems, while millions were made homeless, and the damage to crops, livestock and transport infrastructure would make recovery more difficult. A huge Army and Air Force operation rescued people from stranded trains and airdropped supplies to isolated communities and evacuated some 1,500 villages. Across the world in Mexico, Hurricane Calvin made landfall on the Pacific coast, only the third time on record that a Pacific hurricane had hit the country. It made its way northwards along the coast, winds gusting up to 110 miles an hour, 175 kilometres an hour, and bringing heavy rainfall, storm surges, mudslides and heavy flooding, along with all the usual problems of destroyed crops and property damage. With a decent amount of warning and preparation, only 37 lives were lost, most of them from indirect causes, but some $32 million, 1993 figures, in damage had been done, not least of which was the clean-up cost from a ship caught in heavy seas near Lázaro Cárdenas, which started leaking battery acid into the ocean, which in turn meant that the fishermen couldn't go out. And on the day after the British Grand Prix, a severe earthquake would take place just off the coast of Hokkaido, the northerly of the four main islands of Japan. A tsunami warning was given 5 minutes later, but by that time the wave had already reached the small island of Okushiri, which had already been hit by an earthquake in 1983, and the tsunami defences were overwhelmed and the settlement on the island was devastated. Smaller waves hit not only Hokkaido and the Tohoku region of northern Honshu, but the Russian Far East and Korea too, with the death toll somewhere around 230, though of course any casualties in North Korea are unreported. Olympique de Marseille, the French football club who had just weeks earlier become the first ever French club to win the top European club competition, and the first name inscribed on the new Champions League trophy, were embroiled in a match-fixing scandal. It seemed that with a league match against Valenciennes just 6 days before the Champions League final, Marseille president Bernard Tapie was reminded of the final 2 years earlier when his team had lost to Red Star Belgrade with 2 key players missing. So now a number of players on the Valenciennes team, including 1986 World Cup winner Jorge Burruchaga, were offered financial incentives to take it easy on Marseille and ensure all their players were fit to play in the big game. One of the players, Jacques Glassman, refused and blew the whistle after Valenciennes meekly rolled over 1-0. In the subsequent fallout, Marseille were stripped of their 1992-3 French league title, which remained vacant as runners-up PSG refused to accept it, and Bernard Tapie and player Jean-Jacques Edely, who had been the one to approach the Valenciennes players, both went to jail, while Burruchaga, Christophe Robert, the other player who accepted a bribe, and Marseille general manager Jean-Pierre Berners were also convicted of corruption and received suspended sentences. It was the halfway point in the IndyCar season, with race 8 taking place at the Burke Lakefront Airport in Cleveland, Ohio, one of those tracks the fans love because it's wide, flat so you can see most of it from the stands, and has lots of passing opportunities, while the drivers hate it because the surface is bumpy and uneven. Paul Tracy took pole, with Mansell second, then Fittipaldi and Johansson. Mansell got a good start for once, but an incident further back took out Rahal, Guerrero, Big Al Unser, Boesel, Willie T. Ribbs and Arie Luyendyk and brought out the yellows as the latter three limped back to the pits for repairs and Rahal and Guerrero were out. When the race resumed, so did a fine scrap between Mansell and Tracy, who eased through and started to pull away, as Mansell's determination just couldn't make the difference against the superior Penske chassis. Further back, Little Al Unser and teammate Danny Sullivan renewed hostilities from Detroit, which ended in tears when Unser moved over on Sullivan and they both went spinning. Unser kept going, but Danny had stalled, and both blamed the other, of course. Mansell was now fiercely defending second place from Fittipaldi, the Brazilian getting ahead with 16 laps to go, then losing it again. It was a terrific scrap, reminiscent of the famous one between Villeneuve and Arnoux at Dijon in 1979. Just like on that occasion, it was a race for second that everyone came away talking about, while the winner, in that case the first ever win by a turbo F1 car, in this case Paul Tracy's first Grand Slam win in an IndyCar. In the end it was Fittipaldi who took the place, with Johansson scoring his first points of the year in fourth. Mansell remained on top of the championship, but the Penskes were catching up fast as Fittipaldi moved ahead of Boesel into second. And so to Silverstone, where the atmosphere this year was distinctly peculiar. The British fans had taken Damon Hill to their hearts very quickly, and it seemed a lifetime ago that he'd trailed home 16th and 4 laps down in his pink and blue Brabham. Having come home second on 4 occasions so far this year, it seemed only a matter of time until he finally broke his duck, and there was a general feeling that Silverstone would be the perfect place, as famously his illustrious father had never won here. Teammate Alain Prost had, 5 times so far, for all 3 of his previous teams, Renault, McLaren and Ferrari, and the British media were sharpening their pens, ready to lambast the Frenchman if he did anything to deny Hill his due victory here. The phrase team orders was seldom far from any discussion, and Damon talked to the BBC about it.
Well, going back in history to a few years when the Williams team had the opportunity of winning a world championship, they lost the world championship because they let their drivers fight each other. And I think that Frank is very keen that that shouldn't happen. But having said that, there are no team orders that I'm aware of for this race. Earlier in the season, it wasn't necessary to make any comment about team orders because Alan was more experienced and going better than I was. And but it's obviously a consideration that Frank is concerned that he doesn't want to lose the Drivers' Championship because he's been fighting, or his drivers have been fighting amongst themselves. But the fact of the matter is that as things stand, tomorrow we're going to see a motor race, and hopefully one of the Cannon Williams Renaults will, hopefully my one, will be the one across the line first.
So did Prost, though he was more interested in complaining about his treatment by the media. Local representation was pretty healthy, with Hill joined by Herbert, Warwick and the Brundle twins in making 5 British drivers in the field, and unless anything disastrous happened, they'd all be expecting to start the race and were all in cars capable of scoring points. In fact, only Warwick hadn't yet, and he'd come close a couple of times. All except Damon, along with Perry McCarthy, headed out for a game of golf with the BBC cameras in tow as they followed Lotus for a week between races. It's actually a lovely little item which you can see in the full pre-race show on the Race Day Replay channel, link in the down there part. So the fans were happy enough if the gate was a little down on last year, but in the paddock it was a different story, with the continuing political argy-bargy over electronic aids and now the fuel question too. On the Thursday and Friday after the race, the FIA World Council would finally decide on the electronics issue, with everything banned from Germany onwards still very much on the table. So there was a tense atmosphere among the team principals, who were seen quietly talking in corners or disappearing into each other's motorhomes. The two sides as they arrived at Silverstone were, on the pro-electronic side, Williams, McLaren, Footwork, Ligier, Lotus and Benetton, while the pro-ban side consisted of Ferrari, Larousse, Sauber, Minardi, Tyrrell, Jordan and Scuderia Italia. Benetton and Ferrari had both changed sides in the week since France, though some pundits noted that it was Walkinshaw, not Briatore, visible at the meetings, so maybe Flavio was still secretly talking to Bernie. Cynics likewise suggested that Luca di Montezemolo's sudden road to Damascus conversion to the cause of the ban may well have been down to how far behind his team had slipped with the technology that they, after all, pioneered. Anyway, back to the race weekend, and McLaren were at least able to take possession of their long-sought-after Ford HB Series 7 engines, while Benetton hadn't had their Series 8s delivered due to a manufacturing hold-up at Cosworth, so for this race at least the two would have engine parity, but both were said to be looking elsewhere for next year. McLaren had been noted last week talking to Peugeot, looking for a lightweight TAG Electronics compatible V10, but were also said to be in discussions with Chrysler Lamborghini. Benetton, meanwhile, had apparently been in secret talks with Renault. Over at Ferrari, meanwhile, Jean Todt had popped in to see John Barnard at his Surrey design workshop to see how next year's car was coming along, accompanied by Jean Alesi, while Berger had stayed on at Magny-Cours for 2 days of intensive testing to try and nail that active suspension down, and arrived rather tired. Lotus had also been testing their active suspension, in their case at the little Norfolk circuit of Snetterton near their home base, and they thought they'd got the problem licked, while Sauber had a new evolution of their current engine and were hoping the new one would be available in time for Spa. Pierluigi Martini returned home to Minardi, driving the last 8 races of the year after Fabrizio Barbazza's money ran out. And he's back! After driving for the team in 1985, and then again between 1988 and 91, little Pierluigi had become almost synonymous with the team after his heroics with them in their most successful seasons, 1989 and 91. His 1992 defection to the Scuderia Italia squad turned very sour and had left bad blood that had prevented him returning at the start of 93, but all seems to be forgiven now, and he'll be glad to be back among familiar surroundings, especially with a better car than Minardi have had in some time. But will he be straight back on the pace after 8 months off raising sponsorship? And finally, Tyrrell were able to debut Mike Coughlin's new 021 chassis, still with the dihedral front wings, though less angular and Stuka-like, and with a shorter wheelbase and narrower front track. Friday was hit by the traditional British summer weather, so it was all down to Saturday's times to determine the grid. Hill went out early. After being fastest in the wet, he was fastest in the dry too, until, just after Damon had gone out to do a lap for the crowd, Prost put in one fast lap and just squeaked onto pole by 0.128 seconds. Schumacher was third, 1.4 seconds off the top, then Senna nearly 3 seconds off Prost and 1.5 off Schumacher. Not a happy day at Woking. Patrese had another fine qualifying to line up 5th, with the remaining 4 Brits in the next 4 spots, Brundle, Herbert, Warwick and Blundell, who recovered from crashing badly in Friday's rain, and Warwick's teammate Suzuki in 10th, McLaren's active suspension working wonders on the footwork. Andretti was 11th, complaining of a lack of grip and power, ahead of both Ferraris, which both drivers were finding skittish and hard on tyres. Zanardi might have done better than 14th if he hadn't crashed, while Barrichello had problems with his own suspension, was down in 15th. The Saubers were also down on the grid, lacking grip, the Minardis understeered, as did the new Tyrrell, which was also underpowered. Even the usually half-decent LaRousses were having difficulty with understeer, but once more it was Alboreto who missed the cut, both Lolas over 7 seconds adrift of pole. The clouds were lowering over Silverstone as the cars took to the grid, bringing back memories of the chaotic race at Donington. There were 80,000 at Silverstone compared to the 100,000 who'd mobbed the place to see Mansell last year, but still a fairly healthy turnout. Kenneth Clark, who'd taken over as the Chancellor of the Exchequer in May, was on the grid and would be handing out the prizes later, as was King Hussein of Jordan. The Red Arrows did their thing, and then they were all ready to go, Berger taking the spare Ferrari after his race car developed a fault in that active suspension. And away they went, with both Schumacher and Prost getting away slowly, so it was Damon Hill who led into Copse, chased by Senna, while further back Andretti got his rear wheels on the dirty part and went off backwards, and both Comas and De Cesaris stayed put. The LaRousse apparently had a broken axle, which was of course terminal, but De Cesaris had just stalled and got a push start to get going again. As they came around lap 1, Hill was comfortably ahead of Senna, who had Prost all over his rear wing, and Schumacher was likewise right with the Frenchman, then Brundle and Patrese, Herbert, Alesi, Blundell, Berger, Warwick and Barrichello. And over the initial laps Hill was pulling away, as Senna was forced to drive defensively to keep Prost behind him. Alain was certainly trying hard, getting ahead into Abbey on lap 5, only for Senna to tough it out round the corner and force Prost to back off. Next time around it was Stowe where Senna slammed the door, and again at Bridge, and then all the way through Maggots, with Schumacher now hot on Alain's gearbox too. Finally, at the end of Hanger Straight on lap 7, Prost made it stick, and Schumacher now took up position on Senna's rear wing, and as Prost pulled away, the battle was now between the young charger and the old master. After 3 more laps of Ford Series 7 combat, Schumacher got ahead of Senna at Hanger into Stowe, just where Prost had got past earlier. Off-screen, Berger's active suspension had started predictably playing up, and he came in for new boots and a check-up, while Suzuki spun off at Woodcote and stalled. His teammate Warwick, meanwhile, was going great guns off-camera, having passed Blundell and Alesi to go up to 8th, though he was already some 18 seconds behind 7th-placed Herbert. Alesi's engine was just lacking power, and he was dropping back, soon losing 9th to Blundell. It was apparently not going to be a great day for Maranello again, as Berger trundled back in to retire, the potentiometer on his active suspension having gone for a Burton. As the leaders all streamed past a cruising Berger, Senna was now being caught by Martin Brundle in the Ligier, with Patrese and Herbert not far behind. Up front, meanwhile, Hill was maintaining a gap of about 8 seconds as he started to lap the first backmarkers in the shape of the late-starting Andrea De Cesaris, and the BBC showed off their new live telemetry on Schumacher's car, running about 8 seconds behind Prost. Warwick and Blundell were still running close together in 8th and 9th, the Ligiers going much better than anyone expected them to go here, as the race hit 1/3 distance. On lap 21, Alesi and Barrichello were the first to peel in for tyres, watched by Ron Dennis and Mika Hakkinen from the pit wall. A faulty air gun held up the Ferrari stop and dropped him to 18th as Prost turned up the wick and set a couple of fastest laps, starting to catch Hill as Zanardi made a tyre stop, followed by Brundle, in from 5th and out in 7th, just ahead of the Warwick-Blundell battle. Senna was in next, frustratedly following a distinctly leisurely Boutsen. A greased lightning 5.1 second stop got him out ahead of the Jordan as the marshals escorted Wendlinger to safety after he'd put his Sauber in the barriers at Club. Blundell and Warwick pitted together and the Ligier mechanics got their boy out ahead, and then it was Schumacher's turn, a stop that was only 0.4 seconds slower than Senna's. With Prost now in Hill's mirrors, the Williams crew were ready, but who was coming in? Hill's pitboard went out saying no entry to avoid another Canada incident, so next time around Prost peeled in, following Herbert and Patrese. An 8-second stop wasn't spectacular, but he had plenty of time. Hill was now 22 seconds ahead to make his stop, but had come across a knot of backmarkers and was losing time. Damon came in next time around, made a slightly better stop, and was back out in the lead to the tune of 4 seconds. With all that done and half distance now passing, Hill led Prost, then Schumacher, Senna, Brundle, Herbert, Patrese, Blundell and Warwick, 5 British drivers in the top 9. At the back, De Cesaris's bad afternoon continued after he made a rather ambitious move on Badoer, leading to a bit of wheel bagging, as a result of which the Tyrrell had to come in for a new suspension arm and the Lola rolled to stop on the start-finish straight with no battery power. Hill, meanwhile, was being held up by a recalcitrant Boutsen, allowing Prost to catch up, but at that point the safety car was signalled so Badoer's abandoned Lola could be recovered. So they all slowed up and held station, bunching up behind the Ford Escort Cosworth Turbo, which only led round for a lap before the lights went off, as De Cesaris came back into the pits to the tune of another classic Murrayism.
Into the pit lane comes Andrea De Cesaris, the man who's won more Grand Prix than anybody else in the history of Grand Prix racing without actually winning one of them.
Off pulled the safety car, and away they went again, with Hill and Prost right together, then Blundell 1 lap down, Boutsen 2 laps down, Warwick 1 lap down, and Schumacher 3rd. There were officially no team orders at Williams, but it was understood the drivers had been asked not to race each other in the last 10 laps or so as not to jeopardise the points. And it was now 19 laps to the end. So, if that was true, Hill had to hold out for 9 more laps, or from the other point of view, Prost had 9 laps to get past. Hill put his foot down, drawing away from Prost a little, and setting a new fastest lap, beating Mansell's 1992 record, while Herbert was attacking Patrese in search of 6th place in the final point. But the fairy tale was not to be. On lap 42, 17 before the end, a puff of smoke and a lick of flame signalled the end of Damon's race. He climbed disconsolately out and leaned on the barriers as Prost took the lead, Damon managing a wave to the crowd despite his evident frustration. Zanardi kept him company, spinning off at bridge after his active suspension sensor broke, throwing the car off balance. Scenting an unlikely win, Schumacher was now charging, lapping faster than Prost and just 6.5 seconds behind, though he lost a second passing Blundell. With the battle for the lead taking place on the timing sheets, attention turned to 4th place Brundle, whose pursuit of Senna had been held up by Alesi's reluctance to be lapped, as he battled over 10th with Fittipaldi and Barrichello, while Patrese had been similarly held up by Eric Comas, whose gearshift wasn't working properly and now had Johnny Herbert clambering all over the back of him. With 10 laps to go, Schumacher was still charging, now less than 5 seconds behind Prost, while Blundell made a late error, spinning out at bridge and ending up backwards, getting going again but having lost 7th to Warwick. Prost had sped up a bit and stabilised the gap meanwhile, and Brundle was still stuck behind the Fittipaldi-Barrichello-Alesi scrap and had now gathered Patrese and Herbert right on his tail. The battle for 4th was now between last year's Benetton driver and this year's, both with a point to prove, as well as 3 points to earn, while Johnny Herbert, also an ex-Benetton driver, hoped to benefit from any incident or distraction. The battle ahead, for 10th through 12th, was now easing away as Brundle's engine was starting to fade, and both Patrese and Herbert were trying unsuccessfully to get past. It was cracking viewing with just 5 laps to go, until Brundle's gearbox cried enough and he coasted to a stop, releasing Patrese and Herbert, who now closed up again on Alesi & Co., as De Cesaris did a bit of off-roading, after only just having emerged from the pits, having been in there since the safety car came out. It may only have been for 11th place, but Barrichello was fighting Alesi for it just as hard as anyone else on the track, which could end up impacting the battle for 4th, taking place just behind them as the laps ticked down. Prost cruised home to become the first driver ever to win 50 Grand Prix and his 6th of 9 this year, with Schumacher 2nd, but Senna, running 3rd, ran out of fuel on the last lap just as he had in 1991. So it was a surprise but delighted Riccardo Patrese who came home to take his first Benetton podium, managing to keep Herbert behind him, but the Lotus team could be well satisfied with 4th place, Herbert's 3rd of the year. Lotus, as Murray Walker declared, were back. Senna was classified 5th, with Derek Warwick picking up his and Footwork's first point of the year in 6th. Despite 2 British drivers in the top 6, the fans would go away disappointed at seeing Hill denied a win so close to the end after a dominant performance. The first fastest lap of his career and beating Mansell's record would be scant consolation, especially as he'd lost 3rd place in the overall standings to Schumacher in the process. Prost took to the top step of the British Grand Prix podium for the 5th time, with the 2 yellow-clad Benetton drivers joining him for La Marseillaise and God Save the Queen, or God Save Aunt Liz, as Prince Michael of Kent on the podium might have put it. The Prince and Chancellor Ken Clark gave out the trophies and then made themselves scarce for the champagne shower as thoughts turned to the German Grand Prix in 2 weeks' time, and to that important FIA summit beforehand.